The royal council mocked the silent Omega until she spoke the prophecy that changed the realm. The grand hall of Ashford Manor stretched endlessly beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with centuries of family crests. Rain drummed against the tall windows, blurring the evening light into grey streaks that cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor. Eleanor Ashford stood at the far end of the room, her fingers twisted together in front of her plain grey dress, watching as the council members filtered in with their usual air of superiority. She had learned long ago to make herself invisible in rooms like this. At 23, Eleanor had perfected the art of standing so still that people forgot she was there, a useful skill when you were the youngest daughter of a declining noble house, the one everyone whispered about as simple or slow. Her older sisters had married well, escaping to distant estates with their wealthy husbands. But Eleanor remained, trapped in a house that grew colder with each passing year, her father's disappointment as constant as the rain that never seemed to stop falling on their corner of Massachusetts. The royal council, though royal was a generous term in the American aristocracy of 1847, consisted of 12 families who controlled the textile mills, shipping routes, and political machinery of New England. They gathered quarterly at Ashford Manor, a tradition that dated back to when Eleanor's great-grandfather had been among the most powerful men in the region. Now, the Ashfords clung to relevance by hosting these meetings, offering their crumbling estate as neutral ground while the real power brokers decided the fate of thousands. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything. Eleanor's father, Thomas Ashford, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face drawn and pale. At 58, he looked a decade older, the weight of unpaid debts and social decline etched into every line around his eyes. He barely glanced at Eleanor as she moved quietly along the wall, preparing to take her usual seat in the corner where she would remain silent throughout the proceedings. "The mute mouse graces us with her presence," Richard Blackwell announced loudly as he settled into his chair. Laughter rippled through the room. Blackwell was everything Eleanor's father was not: robust, wealthy, confident, to the point of arrogance. His textile mills employed 3,000 workers under conditions that sparked regular protests, all of which he crushed with the help of local magistrates who were firmly in his pocket. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but kept her eyes down. She had heard worse. Much worse. The council members had spent years treating her like a piece of furniture, sometimes remembering to moderate their language in her presence, more often not bothering at all. "Shall we begin?" Catherine Monroe's crisp voice cut through the murmuring. She was the only woman on the council in her own right, having inherited her husband's shipping empire when he died 5 years ago. Unlike the men who dismissed Eleanor, Catherine simply ignored her completely, which somehow felt worse. The meeting began with typical matters: tariff disputes, labor negotiations, discussions about expanding operations into the newly acquired territories out west. Eleanor listened as she always did, her mind cataloguing information that no one suspected she understood. They thought her silence meant ignorance. They were wrong. An hour passed, then 2. The rain intensified, hammering against the windows like urgent fists. Eleanor noticed the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop, how the candles flickered despite the absence of any draft. Small details that others overlooked, but Eleanor had always been observant. It was one of the few advantages of being invisible. "The workers at the Riverside Mill are becoming troublesome again," Blackwell said, his tone dismissive. "They're demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, the usual complaints." "Crush it like you did last time," suggested James Hartford, whose banking interests financed most of the mills. "Make examples of the ringleaders." "The problem," Catherine Monroe interjected, "is that we're running out of workers willing to accept the conditions." Word spreads. "We need a different approach. What are you suggesting? That we actually listen to their demands? Blackwell laughed, and several others joined him. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. She thought of the workers she had seen during her rare visits to town, men, women and children with hollow eyes and bent backs, their clothes thin against the autumn cold. She thought of the accidents her father mentioned sometimes when he thought she wasn't listening, the injuries that left families without providers, the coughs that turned into something worse during the long winter months. "We could reduce shifts to 12 hours, Catherine said. "Not out of charity, but calculation. Exhausted workers are less productive. We lose less to accidents and illness." "Sentiment!" Blackwell spat. "This is business, not a charity house." The argument escalated, voices rising as positions hardened. Eleanor felt something building in her chest, a pressure that had been accumulating for years. How many meetings had she sat through where human lives were discussed like cargo manifests? How many times had she wanted to speak, to tell them what she saw in the faces of those they exploited? "The workers are replaceable," Blackwell declared. "There are always more desperate people willing to take their places. That's the beauty of our system." Something inside Eleanor snapped. She stood, the movement so unexpected that the room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to her, expressions ranging from surprise to irritation. Her father's face went white with what she recognized as fear, fear of embarrassment, fear of what his strange, silent daughter might do to further damage their already precarious social position. "Sit down, Eleanor," Thomas said quietly, urgently, but Eleanor was done sitting down, done being silent. The words that had accumulated over years of forced muteness came pouring out in a voice that was stronger than anyone expected, including herself. "You mock those who cannot defend themselves," she began, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You build your fortunes on the broken backs of people you consider beneath you, but you are blind to what's coming. This is outrageous." Blackwell sputtered, starting to rise from his chair. "Sit down and listen," Eleanor commanded, and to everyone's shock, including his own, Blackwell sat. The room seemed to contract around her words. The rain outside grew louder, more insistent. Eleanor felt as if she were standing outside herself, watching as this person who looked like her, but possessed an authority she had never known, spoke with absolute certainty. "In 3 months, the workers will rise," she continued, "not with pleas or petitions, but with force. They will burn the mills at Riverside. 16 will die in the flames, including children who work the night shifts that you all pretend don't exist. The fire will spread to the warehouses along the river, destroying half of your inventory before the winter snows come." Catherine Monroe's face had gone pale. "This is madness. Thomas, control your daughter." But Thomas Ashford seemed incapable of movement, staring at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. "That is only the beginning," Eleanor said. "The fire will spark similar actions in every mill town across New England. By spring, you will face organized resistance unlike anything you've imagined. The workers will find leaders, educated men and women who understand how to coordinate, how to build alliances, how to use your own tactics against you." "Empty threats," Hartford said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Not threats," Eleanor replied. "Prophecy. Call it what you will, but I see what's coming because I have watched and listened while you dismissed me as too simple to understand. I have seen the rage building in the faces of those you exploit. I have heard the whispers in the streets, the conversations you never bother to listen to because you believe yourselves too far above such concerns." James Hartford leaned forward, his banker's mind already calculating. "Even if what you say has some merit, and I'm not conceding that it does, what would you have us do?" This was the moment Eleanor had been unconsciously preparing for throughout all those silent years. "You have a choice," she said. You can dismiss me as you always have, continue on your current path, and face the destruction I've described. Or you can change. Change how? Catherine asked, and Eleanor heard genuine curiosity beneath the skepticism. Reduce the working day to 10 hours, increase wages by 20%, install safety equipment in the mills, proper ventilation, guards on the machines, fire escapes, allow workers to organize without retaliation. Create a fund for injured workers and their families. Blackwell burst out laughing. She wants us to bankrupt ourselves. This is why women and fools should never be allowed in council meetings. But others were listening more carefully. Catherine Monroe's sharp eyes studied Eleanor with new interest. These reforms would be expensive, she said slowly, but not as expensive as losing half our infrastructure to fire and facing organized labor actions across the region. This is absurd, Blackwell protested. We're actually considering the ravings of a girl who's never spoken a word in public before today. The girl who's never spoken, Thomas Ashford said quietly, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder or horror, has been in this room for every meeting for the past 5 years. She's heard everything we've discussed, every decision we've made, every consequence we've dismissed. The weight of that realization settled over the room. Eleanor saw understanding dawn in several faces. They had been careless with their words and their secrets because they had assumed she was incapable of comprehension, let alone judgment. How do we know any of what you've said is true? Hartford asked. You speak of prophecy, but that's just dramatic language for guesswork. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. In 2 days, there will be an accident at the Riverside Mill. A support beam weakened by water damage will collapse during the second shift. Without intervention, it will kill 7 workers and injure a dozen more. You know the beam I'm speaking of? Inspectors flagged it 6 months ago, but repairs were deemed too expensive. The room went deathly quiet. Hartford's face confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. He knew exactly which beam she meant because he had approved the decision to delay repairs. That's not prophecy, Blackwell said desperately. That's just knowledge of maintenance records. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed. We'll know in 2 days, won't we? If I'm right about the beam, you might want to consider that I'm right about everything else. She walked toward the door, her legs trembling but her voice steady. You have 3 months before the fire. Use that time wisely. Eleanor left the council chamber, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow echoed through the vast hall. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. In the corridor outside, away from those staring eyes, her knees finally buckled, and she leaned against the wall, breathing hard. What had she done? Years of careful invisibility shattered in a single outburst. But beneath the fear, she felt something else, a fierce satisfaction, a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. Footsteps approached, and Eleanor tensed. But it was only Margaret, the housekeeper, who had been with the Ashford family for 30 years. The old woman looked at Eleanor with an expression of barely contained awe. I heard, Margaret whispered. Word travels fast among the staff. Everyone's talking about how you spoke prophecy to the council. I just told them what I saw coming, Eleanor said weakly. You told them the truth they've been too blind to see, Margaret corrected. But Miss Eleanor, you've made powerful enemies in there. Men like Blackwell don't forgive being challenged, especially not by someone they've dismissed as beneath them. Eleanor knew Margaret was right, but there was no taking back what had been said. The beam at Riverside Mill, she said urgently. Do you know anyone who works there? Margaret nodded slowly. My nephew's wife is on the cleaning crew. Tell her to stay away from the southern wall during the second shift tomorrow and the day after. Tell her to spread the word quietly to anyone she trusts. You really believe it's going to collapse? Eleanor closed her eyes, seeing again the vision that had come to her during the council meeting, not supernatural sight, but the logical conclusion drawn from years of observations she had absorbed, while pretending not to understand. The maintenance records her father left scattered in his study, the conversations about cutting costs that she overheard, the angles of stress she could see even in her memory of the mill's structure. "I know it will," she said simply. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll send word tonight." Inside the council chamber, the argument raged. Catherine Munro had become an unexpected ally, her practical mind recognizing the economic logic behind Eleanor's warnings, even if she doubted the prophetic framing. "The girl may be disturbed," as Catherine said, "but she's not wrong about the conditions in the mills. I've seen the reports we suppress, the injury rates, the illness, the deaths. It's only a matter of time before there's a reaction." "Dodie, coddling workers will destroy our competitive advantage," Blackwell insisted. "The mills in England operate under even worse conditions and remain profitable." "England is also facing organized labor movements that are growing more powerful every year," Hartford pointed out. "Maybe there's wisdom in getting ahead of the problem here." Thomas Ashford sat silently, his mind reeling. His daughter, his strange, silent daughter whom he had always viewed as a burden, had just demonstrated a knowledge and capability that shocked him to his core. How many years had he dismissed her as simple while she absorbed every word spoken in her presence? The meeting adjourned without resolution, but cracks had appeared in the council's united front. As the members departed into the rainy night, several cast thoughtful looks toward the corridor where Eleanor had disappeared. Others, particularly Blackwell, wore expressions of cold anger. Eleanor spent that night in her room, unable to sleep. She kept replaying the meeting in her mind, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But when she thought of the workers, the children especially, working through the night in dangerous conditions, she knew she would make the same choice again. 2 days later, the beam at Riverside Mill collapsed. It happened during the second shift, just as Eleanor had said. But because Margaret's nephew's wife had quietly spread the word, most workers had found excuses to move away from the southern wall. When the massive timber came crashing down, it killed no one. 3 workers sustained minor injuries from debris, but there were no fatalities. The incident sent shockwaves through the industrial district. Workers whispered about the Ashford girl who had seen the future. Council members who had dismissed her words found themselves reconsidering. Even Blackwell, who wanted to maintain his skepticism, couldn't deny the timing and specifics of her prediction. "It was luck," he told the others at an emergency session called 3 days after the collapse. "Or she had inside information from workers planning sabotage." "The beam was rotten," Hartford said quietly. "I sent my own inspector. The damage was from water and age, not tampering." She was right about the cause, the timing, and the location. Catherine Munro leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Which means we need to seriously consider that she might be right about the rest. Even if we don't believe in prophecy, we should believe in patterns. The girl has been watching us for years. She understands things we've foolishly assumed she couldn't comprehend. You're suggesting we actually implement her demands?" Blackwell's face was purple with rage. "I'm suggesting we consider the cost-benefit analysis," Catherine replied coolly. "Reforms now versus rebellion later. It's simple mathematics." The debate that followed was fierce, but the collapse of the beam had tilted the balance. Within 2 weeks, the council voted 7-5 to begin implementing reforms. Not everything Eleanor had suggested, but enough to make a difference. Working hours reduced to 11 hours, with promises of 10 within the year. A modest wage increase. Safety improvements prioritized based on risk assessments. Blackwell and his allies fought every change, but they had lost the momentum. Word of the Ashford prophecy spread beyond the council chambers, carried by servants and workers into every corner of New England's industrial communities. Eleanor became a figure of fascination and controversy. some calling her a prophet, others a fraud, still others believing she was simply an intelligent young woman who had been underestimated for far too long. The reality, Eleanor knew, lay somewhere between all these interpretations. She had no supernatural powers, but years of silent observation had taught her to read patterns others missed. She understood human nature, economic forces, and the breaking point of people pushed too far. What appeared to be prophecy was actually careful analysis combined with moral courage, but perception mattered as much as reality. Workers who had been on the verge of desperate action paused, curious to see if the predicted reforms would materialize. When they did, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, the immediate pressure for violent revolt eased. Not disappeared, but diminished enough to prevent the conflagration Eleanor had foreseen. Richard Blackwell, however, could not accept this new reality. He had built his fortune on the ruthless exploitation of labor, and he saw the reforms as an existential threat not just to his profits, but to his entire worldview. If Eleanor was right, if treating workers humanely could prevent catastrophe, then he had to be wrong, and men like Blackwell could not afford to be wrong. 3 weeks after the council's vote, Eleanor received her first direct threat. A letter, unsigned, delivered to her room by means unknown. The message was brief. Prophets who speak too much truth often meet unfortunate ends. Silence was safer. She showed the letter to Margaret, who immediately wanted to inform Thomas Ashford or even the local authorities, but Eleanor stopped her. Reporting it would only escalate matters, she said. Blackwell, or whoever sent this, wants me afraid, wants me to retreat back into silence. Then what will you do? Eleanor looked out her window at the mill district visible in the distance, where smoke from hundreds of chimneys rose into the grey sky. Somewhere in those buildings, people were working under marginally better conditions because she had found the courage to speak. That had to mean something. I'm going to keep speaking, she said quietly, but more carefully, more strategically. Over the following weeks, Eleanor did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She began visiting the mills, not openly at first, but quietly, dressed in simple clothes that allowed her to blend in with the workers. She wanted to see the changes being implemented, to understand if they were genuine or merely cosmetic. What she found was complicated. Some mill owners, particularly those allied with Catherine Monroe, were making real improvements: better ventilation, safer equipment, reduced hours that were actually enforced. But others, especially those in Blackwell's sphere, were implementing reforms on paper while changing nothing in practice. Workers signed timesheets showing 11-hour days, but were forced to work 13. Safety equipment was installed, but never maintained. Eleanor documented everything she saw, her observations growing more detailed and systematic. She spoke with workers, carefully building trust slowly, and learned their stories. A mother whose daughter had lost 3 fingers to an unguarded machine. Her father whose lungs were destroyed by cotton dust after 15 years in the spinning rooms. Children who worked night shifts and never saw daylight during the winter months. These conversations transformed Eleanor's understanding. Her initial prophecy had been based on analysis and moral reasoning, but now she was developing something deeper, a genuine connection to the people whose lives hung in the balance. Their stories gave her words power beyond mere prediction. 6 weeks after the council meeting, Eleanor requested to speak at the next session. The request itself was unprecedented. No one outside the 12 families had ever addressed the council, but her reputation as the girl who had predicted the beam collapse gave her leverage. Thomas Ashford opposed the idea. "You've already made yourself controversial enough," he told his daughter in one of their few direct conversations. "Speaking again will only make things worse." "For whom?" Eleanor asked. "For our family's social standing, for your comfort, or for the thousands of people depending on whether the council keeps its promises?" Her father had no answer to that. The council meeting in early December was tense from the moment Eleanor entered. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and snow was falling heavily outside. The grand hall felt cavernous and cold, despite the roaring fires in multiple hearths. Eleanor stood before the council, more composed than she had been at her first spontaneous outburst. This time, she came prepared with notes, documentation, and a clear agenda. "Gentlemen and Mrs. Monroe," she began, "I come today not with prophecy but with facts. Some of you have honored your commitments. Your reforms are genuine and producing results: fewer accidents, improved productivity despite reduced hours, better worker morale. But others have made changes in name only." She proceeded to detail specific examples, naming mills and owners who were circumventing the reforms. Blackwell's face grew darker with each accusation, but Eleanor pressed forward, her voice steady. "The original timeline I spoke of, 3 months until fire, can still be avoided, but only if the reforms are universal and genuine. The workers are watching. They see which of you keep your word and which of you treat them as fools. Their patience has limits." "This is slander," Blackwell interrupted. "You have no authority to make these accusations." "I have the authority of truth," Eleanor replied, "and I have witnesses who will testify to every claim I've made. The question is whether this council wants to hear that testimony privately or in a public forum." The implicit threat was clear. She could take her evidence to newspapers, to political allies of the workers, to anyone who would listen. The council's power depended partly on controlling the narrative about labor conditions. Eleanor was threatening to destroy that control. Catherine Monroe spoke into the tense silence. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Ashford?" "An oversight committee," Eleanor said. "Independent inspectors who report directly to this council, not to individual mill owners. Regular audits of working conditions, wage records, and safety implementations, and consequences for those who fail to meet standards." "Preposterous," Blackwell sputtered. "We would be policing ourselves, undermining our own authority. We would be ensuring our own survival," Catherine countered. She looked at Eleanor with something approaching respect. "The girl has a point. If we can't maintain consistent standards, the whole reform effort becomes meaningless. Workers will lose faith and will face exactly the crisis we're trying to prevent." The debate raged for hours. In the end, a compromise emerged. Not everything Eleanor wanted, but more than Blackwell had wanted to concede. A limited oversight system would be established, with inspectors reporting to a committee of council members, including Catherine Monroe and 2 others sympathetic to reform. It was a victory, but Eleanor left the meeting with a sense of unease. Blackwell had agreed too easily in the end, his opposition collapsing once it became clear he was outnumbered. That wasn't like him. Men who built fortunes on ruthlessness didn't surrender peacefully. Her instinct proved correct 2 weeks later when the first oversight inspector, a retired engineer named Samuel Wright, was found dead in an alley near the Riverside Mills. Official reports called it a robbery gone wrong, but Wright's wallet was still in his pocket and his inspection notes were missing. The message was clear: reformers would face consequences. Eleanor heard about Wright's death from Margaret, who brought the news with a white, frightened face. "They're saying it was just a robbery, but everyone knows better," the housekeeper whispered. "Miss Eleanor, you need to be careful. If they'd kill an inspector, they'd certainly target you." For the first time since speaking prophecy to the council, Eleanor felt genuine fear. She had known intellectually that she was challenging powerful men, but Wright's death made the danger visceral and immediate. She thought about the unsigned threatening letter, about Blackwell's cold eyes, about how easy it would be to arrange an accident for a young woman already considered strange and isolated. But the fear was accompanied by anger. Wright had been a good man, dedicated to the cause of safer working conditions because his own brother had died in a mill accident years ago. His death could not be meaningless. Eleanor made a decision that would alter the course of everything to come. She went to Catherine Munro. The meeting took place at Munro's Boston townhouse, an elegant brick building overlooking the common. Catherine received Eleanor in a study filled with ledgers and maritime charts. The tools of her shipping empire spread across every surface. "You're braver than I expected," Catherine said, gesturing Eleanor to a chair. "Most people would have fled back to silence after Wright's death." "Silence is what they want," Eleanor replied. "It's what they've always wanted from me." Catherine studied her carefully. "Why did you really come to speak to the council that first time?" "The truth, not the theatrical prophecy." Eleanor considered lying, maintaining the mystique that had given her power. But she sensed that Catherine would respect honesty more than pretense. "I saw patterns," she admitted. "Years of listening taught me how the mill owners think, how workers respond, how pressure builds until something breaks. The specific timeline was an educated guess, but the general trajectory was inevitable. People can only be pushed so far before they push back." "And the beam collapse?" "Maintenance records, structural knowledge, and basic physics. My father leaves documents scattered everywhere. I've been reading them since I was 15. A smile crossed Catherine's face. "So, you're not a prophet, just extremely observant and unusually brave." "Does it matter which? To me? No. I prefer working with intelligence rather than mysticism, but to others, especially the workers, your reputation as a prophet is powerful. It gives you influence beyond your actual social position." Catherine leaned forward. "The question is what you plan to do with that influence, now that men like Blackwell are willing to kill to stop you." "I need allies," Eleanor said simply. "Wright's death proves that the resistance to reform is violent and organized. Fighting that alone is impossible. You want my protection. I want your partnership. You have the resources and connections I lack. I have the understanding of workers and the moral authority to speak for them. Together, we might actually create lasting change instead of cosmetic reforms that collapse at the first sign of opposition." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her sharp mind clearly calculating risks and benefits. "If I align with you openly," she said slowly, "I risk splitting the council permanently. Some will see it as betrayal of our class interests." "You'll also position yourself as a leader rather than a follower," Eleanor countered. "When the inevitable confrontation comes, and it will come, whether in 3 months or 3 years, you'll be on the right side, the side that history will vindicate." "You sound very certain about what history will vindicate." "I'm certain that the current system is unsustainable. Reform now or revolution later, those are the only options. Everything else is just delaying tactics." Catherine stood and walked to her window, looking out at the snow-covered common where workers and merchants moved through the winter afternoon. "I've been thinking along similar lines," she admitted. "The workers in my shipping yards are becoming more organized, more educated. They're reading radical literature from Europe, forming associations. Crushing them grows more difficult every year." She turned back to Eleanor. "But open alliance with you would require more than just good intentions. We'd need a plan, specific goals. And we'd need to move quickly before Blackwell and his allies consolidate their opposition." Over the next 2 hours, the 2 women, one a young aristocrat who had broken years of silence, the other a widowed businesswoman who had defied social conventions to run a commercial empire, planned what would become known as the New England Labor Accord. The plan was ambitious. A comprehensive reform package that would standardize working conditions across all council-controlled industries. 10-hour working days enforced by law, not voluntary compliance. Safety standards with real penalties for violations. An end to child labour under age 12, the right of workers to form associations without retaliation. This will bankrupt some of the smaller operators, Catherine warned. Those running on thin margins won't survive the increased costs. Then they shouldn't be in business, Eleanor said bluntly. An enterprise that depends on exploiting children and killing workers through negligence isn't a legitimate business. It's organized cruelty for profit. Catherine laughed, a sharp bark of surprise. You would have made an excellent merchant. Eleanor, you have the ruthlessness needed for difficult decisions. I've learned from the best, Eleanor replied, thinking of the council members she had watched for years. They agreed to present the accord at the next council meeting, scheduled for 2 weeks hence. In the meantime, Catherine would work on securing additional allies, while Eleanor continued gathering evidence of ongoing abuses to strengthen their case. But Blackwell was preparing his own response. The first Eleanor knew of his countermove was when her father called her to his study 3 days before the scheduled council meeting. Thomas Ashford looked older than ever, his face grey with stress. "The council has been approached with a proposal," he said without preamble. "Richard Blackwell is offering to purchase Ashford Manor and assume all our outstanding debts in exchange for certain considerations." Eleanor felt cold spread through her chest. "What considerations?" "Your permanent withdrawal from public life. No more council appearances, no more mill visits, no more organizing. In essence, a return to your previous silence, but formalized. You would be sent to live with your sister in Philadelphia, removed entirely from New England affairs." "He's trying to buy my silence. He's trying to save our family from ruin," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Eleanor, our debts are crushing. Without this offer, we face bankruptcy within the year. The manor will be seized, our remaining lands sold off. Everything our family built over generations will be gone." Eleanor looked at her father and saw not strength, but defeat. He had already decided to accept Blackwell's offer if she agreed. The choice was hers alone. "What did you tell him?" she asked quietly. "That I needed to discuss it with you. He gave us until tomorrow to decide." Eleanor stood and walked to the window of her father's study, the same window where she had stood countless times as a child, watching the world beyond the manor's gates. She thought about Wright's death, about the workers whose lives depended on whether reform succeeded, about the choice between comfortable silence and dangerous truth. "Tell Blackwell I decline," she said. "Eleanor, tell him I decline and tell him why. Tell him that some things matter more than property or position. Tell him that his attempt to buy my silence has convinced me more than ever that he's afraid of what I represent." "We'll lose everything." Eleanor turned to face her father. "You'll lose a house and some land. I nearly lost my voice entirely, the ability to speak, to think, to be fully human. That's the real loss. Compared to that, this manor is just wood and stone." Something shifted in Thomas Ashford's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or dawning respect. "When did you become so brave?" he asked softly. "When I finally understood what cowardice costs," Eleanor replied. The next day, Thomas delivered Eleanor's answer to the council. Blackwell's fury was said to be volcanic. He immediately moved to expel the Ashfords from the council entirely, but Catherine Monroe blocked the motion, citing centuries of tradition. The council was fracturing visibly now, with battle lines drawn clearly between reformers and those defending the old system. The scheduled meeting became a confrontation unlike any in the council's history. Eleanor arrived with Catherine, flanked by 2 armed guards hired by the shipping magnate. The precaution seemed excessive until they noticed similar guards accompanying Blackwell. "We're on the verge of actual violence," Margaret whispered as she helped Eleanor prepare. "This isn't politics anymore, it's war." The meeting began with forced civility that deteriorated within minutes. When Catherine formally introduced the New England Labor Accord, Blackwell exploded. "This is extortion," he roared. "You're holding our entire industrial base hostage to the ravings of an unstable girl and the mercenary calculations of a woman who's forgotten her place." "My place," Catherine said coldly, "is at the head of one of the most successful shipping companies in America. Where's your place, Richard? Presiding over mills where children die and workers are maimed. That's a legacy you want to defend." The room erupted in arguments. Council members shouted over each other while Eleanor sat quietly, letting the chaos unfold around her. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing she could do was simply observe, letting others reveal themselves through their reactions. James Hartford finally called for order, his banker's instinct for negotiation overriding the emotional displays. "We need compromise," he said. "Neither extreme position is tenable. Miss Ashford, what would you accept as a minimum?" Eleanor had been prepared for this question. "4 things," she said clearly. "First, enforcement of the 10-hour day within 60 days, with independent verification. Second, immediate implementation of basic safety standards, guards on machines, fire exits, ventilation. Third, an end to employment of children under 12. Fourth, the right of workers to organize without facing dismissal or blacklisting." "That's not compromise," Blackwell said. "That's surrender." "No," Eleanor replied. "Surrender would be accepting your attempt to buy my silence and allowing conditions to continue unchanged. This is the minimum necessary to prevent the catastrophe I originally predicted." "Your prophecy was wrong," Blackwell shouted. "It's been 3 months since your first warning, and there's been no fire, no uprising. You're a fraud." Eleanor stood slowly, her eyes locked on Blackwell. When she spoke, her voice carried throughout the room with an authority that silenced all other conversation. "The timeline changed because you, some of you, began making changes. The future isn't fixed, Richard. It responds to present actions. I predicted what would happen if nothing changed. Things changed, so the outcome shifted. That's not prophecy failing, that's prophecy working exactly as it should." She paused, letting that sink in. "But the underlying pressures remain. The anger, the desperation, the breaking point, all of that is still there. You've bought time with your partial reforms, but time runs out. Accept the accord, implement real change, and you secure your futures. Reject it, and you'll face something worse than fire. You'll face a workers' movement that has learned from your resistance, that understands you'll only respond to force." "More threats," Blackwell muttered, but Eleanor noticed that others were listening intently. "Not threats," she corrected. "Options. You have a choice right now that you won't have later. Make it wisely." The vote was close, 7-5, the same margin as before. The New England Labor Accord was adopted, though Blackwell immediately announced he would not implement its provisions in his mills. He had 4 other council members who supported his refusal. "Then you'll face the consequences alone," Catherine said. "The reforming mills will distance themselves from you. When the workers rise, it will be against your facilities specifically, and the rest of us will not come to your aid." It was a declaration of schism. The council, which had operated for decades as a unified power structure, had split into 2 factions. The reformers, led by Catherine Monroe and grudgingly supported by Thomas Ashford, controlled 7 votes. The traditionalists, led by Blackwell, held 5. Over the next 2 months, the split became visible throughout New England's industrial landscape. Mills implementing the accord saw remarkable changes, not just in working conditions but in worker attitudes. Productivity increased despite reduced hours. Accidents decreased dramatically. The nascent labor organizations that had been forming in secret began operating more openly, but with a focus on cooperation rather than confrontation. Meanwhile, Blackwell's mills became pressure cookers. Workers who tried to organize were fired and blacklisted as promised. Safety conditions actually deteriorated as Blackwell cut costs to maintain profit margins in the face of competition from reformed mills. The contrast became stark enough that workers began migrating from traditionalist mills to reformed ones, forcing Blackwell to recruit increasingly desperate laborers. Eleanor continued her mill visits, now openly rather than in disguise. Workers began calling her the Prophet, a title that made her uncomfortable but which she recognized as tactically useful. When she spoke at workers' meetings, hundreds came to listen. Her message was consistent. Change was possible through organization and pressure, but violence would only play into the hands of those who wanted to crush reform. In early March, nearly 6 months after Eleanor's first prophecy, the explosion came. Not fire, as originally predicted, but something equally devastating, a boiler explosion at Blackwell's largest mill. The ancient, poorly maintained equipment ruptured during an overnight shift, releasing superheated steam into the spinning room. 23 workers died instantly. Dozens more suffered horrific burns. The sound of the explosion was heard across the city, and the column of smoke was visible for miles. Eleanor heard the news from a messenger who arrived at Ashford Manor just after dawn. She felt sick, physically ill, because part of her had known something like this was coming, not the specific cause or timing, but the inevitability of disaster in facilities operating under such dangerous conditions. By noon, she was at the scene. The mill was a wreck. Its southern wall collapsed, the interior visible through jagged openings. Medical workers and volunteers were still pulling bodies from the rubble. The smell of burnt flesh and scorched metal hung heavy in the cold air. Catherine Munro found her there, standing among the crowds of workers and families who had gathered, many weeping openly. "This is what you saw," Catherine said quietly. "Not fire, but this." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Different means, same end. Blackwell pushed too hard, cut too many corners, and people died." "He's finished," Catherine said. "The city authorities are already investigating. His other council allies are abandoning him. By tomorrow, he'll be facing criminal charges." But Eleanor wasn't thinking about Blackwell's fate. She was watching the faces of the workers, seeing rage mixed with grief, fear mixed with determination. This disaster would radicalize them in ways that no amount of organizing ever could. "We need to move quickly," she said, "before this tragedy turns into something worse." That evening, Eleanor did something unprecedented. She called a public meeting at the largest hall in the city. Not a council meeting, not a workers' assembly, but a gathering open to everyone, mill owners, workers, reformers, families of the victims. Over 1,000 people came. Eleanor stood on a stage, looking out at the sea of faces. She saw grief and anger, hope and despair, all mixed together in a moment of collective trauma. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady despite her internal trembling. "Today, 23 people died because of choices made by men who valued profit over human life," she began. "Their names were James, Mary, Thomas, Elizabeth." She read all 23 names slowly, giving weight to each one. By the time she finished, many in the audience were weeping. "We cannot bring them back," Eleanor continued, "but we can ensure they didn't die for nothing. Their deaths prove what some of us have been saying for months. The old system is not just unjust, it's deadly. It must end completely, not partially, not in some mills, while others continue grinding up human lives for profit." She paused, letting the moment breathe. 6 months ago, I spoke what some called prophecy. I predicted catastrophe if things didn't change. Things changed partially, and catastrophe was delayed but not prevented. Now I offer a different kind of prophecy, one about the future we could build together if we choose courage over comfort, justice over profit, humanity over indifference. For the next hour, Eleanor laid out a vision of industrial reform that went beyond anything the Labour Accord had proposed. Fair wages tied to productivity, worker representation in management decisions, profit sharing that gave labourers a stake in their company's success, public oversight of safety conditions, compensation funds for injured workers and their families. Some will call this radical, she said. Some will call it impossible. But 6 months ago they called me insane for suggesting 10-hour workdays and basic safety equipment. Everything impossible becomes possible once enough people decide to make it real. The crowd's response was thunderous, not universal. Some mill owners walked out, and some workers shouted that Eleanor's reforms didn't go far enough, but powerful enough to shift the entire conversation. By the next morning, newspapers across New England were running her speech. Political figures who had previously ignored labor issues were suddenly calling for investigations and reform. Blackwell was arrested within the week, charged with criminal negligence in the deaths of 23 workers. His mills were seized pending investigation. Other Traditionalist Council members scrambled to distance themselves from him, suddenly implementing reforms they had resisted for months. The council itself was transformed. The 5 Traditionalist votes collapsed to 2, and even those members were now supporting moderate reform. Catherine Monroe emerged as the de facto leader, with Thomas Ashford, his own transformation complete, serving as her deputy. Eleanor was offered a formal seat on the council, but she declined. "My power comes from being outside the structure," she explained to Catherine. "The moment I become part of the council officially, I lose the ability to speak for workers without conflict of interest." "You could do more from inside," Catherine argued. "I can do more from exactly where I am, bridging the gap between workers and owners, translating grievances into proposals into action. That's my role." Spring came to Massachusetts with unusual warmth. The mills that had implemented reforms were thriving, their workers more productive and committed than ever. Labor organizations that might have turned violent instead became partners in the new system, their leaders meeting regularly with mill owners to address problems before they escalated. The change wasn't universal or perfect. Some mills still operated under brutal conditions. Some workers remained exploited and desperate. But the trajectory had shifted, the precedent established. What had seemed impossible 6 months ago, treating industrial workers as human beings deserving of dignity and fair compensation, was becoming normalized. Eleanor continued her work, now openly recognized as a labor advocate. She traveled throughout New England, speaking at mills and worker associations, always carrying the message of organized reform rather than violent resistance. The title Prophet stuck, though she never claimed supernatural insight. One evening in late April, she stood again at the window of her father's study, now her study, as Thomas had essentially retired from public affairs, content to let his daughter manage what remained of the family's influence. She looked out at the mill district, where lights blazed from facilities operating under the new shorter shifts, where workers returned home while daylight still remained, where children played instead of laboring. Margaret brought her tea and stood beside her. "You changed the world," the old housekeeper said softly. "I changed one part of one region," Eleanor corrected. "The rest of the country still operates under the old system. It will take decades to spread these reforms nationally." "But you started it. That's what prophets do. They see the future and help others see it too." Eleanor smiled. "I saw the pattern and had the courage to speak. Anyone could have done the same. But only you did." That was true, Eleanor acknowledged silently. She had been in a unique position, invisible long enough to understand the system completely, but eventually brave enough to challenge it. Her silence had been training for the moment when her voice would matter most. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Catherine Monroe entered. her usual crisp efficiency tempered by something that looked like excitement. "I have news," Catherine said. "The state legislature is considering a bill to mandate 10-hour workdays and safety standards across all industries. They're using the Labor Accord as their template. If it passes, Massachusetts will have the most progressive labor laws in America." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction. Legal reform meant changes that would outlast any individual's influence, that would protect workers even after the current wave of activism faded. "That's significant," she said. "When do they vote?" "Next month, and they want you to testify." The idea of addressing the state legislature was daunting, but Eleanor had learned that daunting was where important work lived. "I'll do it," she said. Over the next 4 weeks, Eleanor prepared testimony that would detail everything she had learned about industrial conditions, worker grievances, and the economic viability of reform. She gathered statistics from reformed mills showing that productivity increased with better conditions. She collected testimonials from workers whose lives had improved. She created a comprehensive case that reform was not just morally necessary, but economically sound. The testimony was scheduled for a Tuesday in May. Eleanor traveled to Boston with Catherine, Thomas, and Margaret, her unofficial family, she realized, the people who had supported her transformation from silent observer to public advocate. The legislative chamber was packed with spectators. Mill owners and workers, reformers and conservatives, journalists and politicians, all crowded together to hear what the prophet of the mills would say to the state's lawmakers. Eleanor stood before the assembled representatives, notes in hand, and began to speak. Not with prophecy this time, but with careful logic and documented evidence. She described conditions she had witnessed, changes she had seen implemented, results that proved reform was possible. "Gentlemen," she concluded, "you have before you a choice similar to the one the Royal Council faced 6 months ago. You can dismiss these concerns as the complaints of malcontents, as attacks on free enterprise, as impossible demands. Or you can recognize that the current system is unsustainable and that reform now is vastly preferable to revolution later." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the chamber. "I don't claim to see the future with supernatural clarity, but I do see patterns. I see cause and effect, and I see that societies which fail to adapt to changing conditions eventually collapse. Your choice today will determine whether Massachusetts leads the nation in progressive labor reform or becomes an example of what happens when leaders lack the courage to change." The testimony lasted 3 hours, including questions from legislators. Some were hostile, accusing Eleanor of being a radical or a puppet of labor organizers. Others were genuinely curious, asking detailed questions about implementation and costs. Still others were already convinced, using their questions to build public support for the legislation. In the end, the vote was close, narrowly passing in both chambers by margins of just a few votes. But it passed. Massachusetts became the first state in America to mandate 10-hour workdays, require basic safety standards, prohibit child labor under age 12, and establish penalties for employers who violated these provisions. Eleanor attended the signing ceremony, watching as the governor put his name to legislation that would transform thousands of lives. She thought about the long journey from silence to this moment, about all the small choices that had led here. But she also knew this was not an ending. It was barely a beginning. The Massachusetts legislation sparked similar movements in other states. Rhode Island and Connecticut began considering parallel reforms. New York labor organizations pointed to Eleanor's success as proof that change was possible. Even in the South, where industrial conditions were often worse than New England, reformers began organizing around similar principles. Not everyone was pleased with these developments. Conservative newspapers denounced Eleanor as a dangerous radical. Some mill owners who had been forced to implement reforms began organizing politically to repeal the new laws. And there were still men like Blackwell, currently awaiting trial, who saw the entire movement as an attack on their natural right to run businesses however they chose. Eleanor received threats regularly now. Some were crude and easily dismissed, others were sophisticated and genuinely frightening, detailing intimate knowledge of her movements and implicit promises of violence. She hired bodyguards on Catherine's insistence, though she hated the restriction on her freedom. "You're too valuable to the movement to risk," Catherine said bluntly when Eleanor complained about the security. "Your death would set back reforms by years. Your martyrdom might inspire others, but your continued work will accomplish more." It was a pragmatic argument that Eleanor couldn't refute. So she accepted the guards, the restrictions, the constant awareness that some people would prefer her silenced permanently. Summer brought new challenges. Some mills that had implemented reforms began struggling financially, unable to compete with facilities in other states operating under the old system. Workers in reformed mills were sometimes laid off as owners cut costs, leading to complaints that reform had made things worse rather than better. Eleanor addressed these concerns head-on in a series of public speeches. "Reform is not magic," she said at a workers' assembly in July. "It doesn't solve every problem instantly. Some businesses that depended entirely on exploitation will fail, and should fail. But the evidence shows that well-run operations can thrive under better conditions. What we need now is patience and continued pressure to level the playing field nationally." She also began advocating for something new: tariffs on goods produced under exploitative conditions. If mills in other states can undercut Massachusetts businesses because they work children 14 hours a day, she argued, then we need to protect our reformed industries. Not with a return to old practices, but with policies that make exploitation economically non-viable. This idea proved controversial even among her allies. Free trade advocates opposed anything that smacked of protectionism. Some workers worried that tariffs would raise prices they couldn't afford, but Eleanor persisted, recognizing that sustainable reform required addressing competitive disadvantages. By autumn, a new equilibrium had emerged. Reformed mills were stabilizing, though profits were lower than under the old system. Workers had better conditions but also higher expectations, leading to ongoing negotiations and occasional tensions. The legislative framework existed but required constant defense against those seeking to weaken or repeal it. Eleanor found herself in an unexpected role, not just an advocate, but a mediator. She spent her days moving between worker meetings and owner negotiations, translating demands into proposals, explaining economic realities to labor organizations, and pushing both sides toward pragmatic compromise. It was exhausting work, and sometimes she longed for the simplicity of her silent years, when she had no responsibility beyond her own thoughts. But then she would visit a mill, and see children playing outside instead of working inside, or meet a worker whose life had been saved by new safety equipment, and she knew the exhaustion was worth it. One October evening, she received an unexpected visitor at Ashford Manor. A young woman, perhaps 19, stood nervously in the entrance hall. She wore a worker's plain dress, but carried herself with unusual confidence. "Miss Ashford," the woman said. "My name is Sarah Brennan. I work at the Monroe Textile Mill in Lowell. I came because I need to tell you something." Eleanor invited her to the study, offering tea while Margaret hovered protectively nearby. Sarah sat on the edge of her chair, hands clasped tightly. "I heard you speak at the Workers' Assembly in July," Sarah began. "You said that change comes from people having courage to speak truth. Well, I've been watching and listening at our mill, like you did with the council, and I see things that need to be said." Eleanor leaned forward, interested. "What kind of things?" "The reforms are working, but they're not enough. Women workers get paid half what men do for the same work. We can't vote in union decisions even though we're the majority of workers. When we complain about harassment from supervisors, we're told to be grateful we have jobs at all. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. You changed things for all workers, but someone needs to speak specifically for women workers. I think that someone might need to be me. Eleanor felt recognition wash over her. This young woman was at the beginning of a journey Eleanor knew well. The journey from silent observation to finding your voice, from seeing injustice to confronting it. You're right, Eleanor said simply. Women workers face specific challenges that the general reforms didn't address. And yes, someone needs to speak about that. But Sarah, it will cost you. Speaking truth always does. I know, Sarah replied. I've watched what you've faced, the threats, the accusations, the way people try to silence you, but I've also watched what you've achieved. If I stay silent about women's issues because I'm afraid, I'm no different from the people who stayed silent about worker conditions generally. They talked for 2 hours, Eleanor sharing lessons learned about organizing, building alliances, choosing battles wisely. By the time Sarah left, Eleanor had committed to helping launch a women's labor organization focused on issues like equal pay, workplace harassment, and representation in union leadership. It was a reminder that reform was never finished. Each victory revealed new injustices that had been hidden beneath more obvious ones. The work would continue long after Eleanor was gone, carried forward by people like Sarah who found courage to speak their own truths. Winter came early that year. By November, snow blanketed the mill district and workers arrived at reformed facilities knowing they would work shorter hours in safer conditions than their parents had endured. It wasn't paradise. The work remained hard. Pay was still barely adequate, accidents still happened despite precautions, but the trajectory had changed and that mattered. On a cold December evening, almost exactly 1 year after her first testimony to the legislature, Eleanor stood again at her study window. The anniversary felt significant, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps because it marked how quickly everything had transformed. From silence to prophecy to advocacy to something that resembled normalcy, though a normalcy she could never have imagined in her silent years. Catherine Monroe arrived for their weekly strategy meeting, stamping snow from her boots in the entrance hall. They had plans to discuss, new legislation being proposed, organizing efforts in neighboring states, responses to increasing opposition from conservative mill owners. But as they settled into the study, Catherine handed Eleanor a letter. "This came to my office," she said. "It's from a workers' group in New York. They want you to come speak to help them organize their own reform movement." Eleanor read the letter, feeling the weight of expectation in every word. They called her the voice of industrial conscience, the prophet who changed New England, the woman who proved that one person speaking truth could transform society. The titles made her uncomfortable. She was none of those things really, just someone who had been silent long enough to see clearly and then brave enough to speak. Anyone could have done the same. "What do you think?" Catherine asked. "New York could be the next frontier. If we can replicate Massachusetts reforms there, we create momentum that becomes impossible to stop." Eleanor thought about Sarah Brennan, about the dozens of other organizers who had emerged from the worker ranks, about how the movement no longer depended on any single voice. Maybe that was the real measure of success, when the prophet became unnecessary because everyone had learned to speak for themselves. "I'll go," Eleanor said, "but not alone. We bring Sarah and some of the other worker leaders. Make it clear that this movement belongs to them, not to me." Catherine smiled. "You're thinking strategically. Good. The cult of personality around you is useful, but also dangerous. Better to build a movement of voices than depend on one prophet." They spent the next hour planning the New York campaign. Who would speak where? What arguments would resonate with different audiences? How to build coalitions between workers and sympathetic owners? The work was detailed and sometimes tedious, but Eleanor had learned that lasting change came through this kind of careful planning, not dramatic gestures. As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "You know," she said, "when you first spoke at that council meeting, I thought you were either insane or brilliant. I'm still not entirely sure which." Eleanor laughed. "Maybe both. Maybe that's what it takes. A bit of madness to imagine things could be different, and enough brilliance to figure out how." After Catherine left, Eleanor remained in the study, thinking about the year behind her and the years ahead. The prophecy she had spoken, the prediction of fire and uprising, had been both wrong and right. Wrong in specifics because circumstances changed. Right in essence because the underlying truth remained. Systems built on exploitation would eventually collapse, whether through fire or explosion or simple unsustainability. Her real gift, she recognized, hadn't been seeing the future. It had been seeing the present clearly enough to understand what it would become if nothing changed, and then having the courage to speak that understanding aloud, despite years of conditioning that told her to stay silent. The work would continue. There would be more struggles, more resistance, more moments when progress seemed impossible. But the foundation had been laid. The impossible had become possible, and once people saw that transformation, they would never fully accept the old system again. Eleanor picked up her pen and began writing notes for the New York trip. Outside, snow continued to fall on the Mill District, covering everything in white. Tomorrow, workers would wake and go to jobs that were marginally more humane than the year before. Children would attend school instead of laboring in dangerous conditions. Women like Sarah Brennan would begin organizing for their own specific concerns. None of it was perfect. All of it was progress. And sometimes, Eleanor thought as she wrote, progress was prophecy enough.